Hello everyone and welcome to this masterclass. Today we're going to talk about noise and specifically noise within hiring. So I'm very happy that so many are joining for this session. It's an exciting one and something I care about a lot. And what I'm going to speak to you about is what is noise and how does this differ from something more famous, which is called bias. We speak about bias a lot, and noise could be seen as a little less famous sibling, basically. And then we're going to talk about the strategies that you can use to reduce noise in your hiring process. And I want you to leave with some practical next steps that you can bring with you into the fall. And with me here today, I have my fantastic colleague, Frida, who will basically be the voice of TA, I think. Frida, do you want to introduce yourself a little bit?
Absolutely. Thank you, Anna. The voice of TA. Love it. So I work today as a senior customer success manager at Alva Labs, but I have a background within HR and talent acquisition as well. So for the past decade, actually, wow, time flies, I've been focusing a lot on, I would say, high volume hiring at scale in a global context. I've been around at some of the companies that I see at least as very, people-oriented and forward-leaning when it comes to TA. So I started my career at Spotify, moved on to Amazon, and then King was my latest employer. And then and there, the standards was amazing, very, very high when it comes to bringing in the right talent. That is a strategically very, very important decision, right? But still, bias and noise sneaks in, regardless, how high bar you have. We are all humans. So I'm here to try to, convert the theory into practice and give some more concrete examples from my career so far within TA, but also the customers that I collaborate with on a daily basis at my role at Alva. It's very fun to be here with you, Anna.
Thank you for taking me in. I'm very, very happy that you're joining and look forward to hearing your thoughts and example. So who am I then? Well, I'm the people science lead at Alva. I'm Anna. I'm a psychologist who have been working at Alva for 5 years by now. Before then, I worked clinically. So back then, I noticed that a lot of the times when working with my colleagues then, who were doctors or other psychologists or nurses, it wasn't that uncommon that we disagreed. So even though we had this very, very detailed specific manual called the DSM-5, which is the one you use within clinical psychology, we disagreed. So we had different conclusions. Even though we had the same data points, all of us, we differed. And already back then, I was thinking, why is that? We are all practiced, well-meaning professionals, and we still can't agree. So then I learned that this is common. So in field studies around DSM-5, it's actually been shown that even, psychiatrists, if one says, well, I think this patient is suffering from major depressive disorder, for example, only 4 to 15% of the time will another psychiatrist agree. So that's pretty striking, I think. Even though you've studied for a long time, you have worked for a long time, and you had this kind of very detailed manual, you still disagree with one another. And why is that then? And what does that tell us also about hiring? And it tells a lot. So we're going to talk about that today. Why is it that well-practiced, well-meaning professionals often end up in different conclusions, even though you have the same data, right? One of it, of course, bias is there. But today we're going to focus on noise. And noise is a less famous, less noisy sibling of bias, basically. There's a whole book about this. It's written by Kahneman. And most people have heard about the book Thinking Fast and Slow, but few have heard about noise, I think, or at least few have read it. You might have heard about it, but you haven't read it. And I recommend everyone, literally everyone, but maybe specifically those working within hiring, to read this book. It's very informative, and it is about the topic that I just spoke about. Why does people end up in different conclusions based on the same data points. And if you only read one chapter and you work within hiring, or TA, I think the one you should read is the one about selection, interviews, and hiring. I highly recommend that one. It's 10 pages, but it's very, very informative. And I'm going to explain now, what is then the difference between noise and bias? We speak a lot about bias within hiring, but something I noticed from my work within Alva and also previously is that noise is not mentioned that often. And bias, that means, like, we want to be on target, right? When we make decisions, we want to be on target as many times as possible. So if we make repeated decisions as a professional or between different assessors, we want to be consistent, right? We want to make the accurate decision. And being biased, that means that we systematically kind of miss the target. We are in one direction, we're still tight, but we're making the wrong decision. We're being biased in some direction, some specific direction. Being noisy, that's something different. We might be circling around an average. We're not being specifically biased, but we're being a bit random. We're seeing some random variation in our decisions, and that's something else, right? We can be both biased and noisy, what you see here on the last picture, that you can also be biased and noisy. And that means that we might, be leaning towards a certain direction, aka biased, but we're still noisy. There's some random variation going on, right? So in a nutshell, basically, noise is that kind of random variation. I'm not going to get too technical. Here you see a pretty complicated picture, right? And it's a bit similar to Pythagoras' theorem. But I'm not going to get too deep into this. And I'm going to try to simplify it a little bit to get my point across. And that is that if we think about error in a system or hiring error as a whole, what drives that is both the bias and noise. And that noise can be caused by different sources. So there's different sources of noise. We have 3 different versions here, and that is level noise, stable pattern noise, and occasion noise. And I'm going to talk about these 3 today so that you get more knowledge, hopefully, around these different sources of noise and apply those to hiring. So another thing I want to make clear is that if we pour all of our efforts and focus on bias specifically and forget about noise, we're only fixing one part of the problem. So the problem is actually both bias and noise. So these 3 sources of noise are, first of all, the level noise. And if we apply that to hiring, that means that, different judges or different assessors, I'm going to call everyone who makes a judgment a judge here. So it's not a legal reference. It's everyone who makes a judgment. They are judges. And if we think about level noise, that is the fact that we have different tendencies to be harsh or lenient. So we have different internal kind of scales or levels, that is. And that will create a lot of noise. And if you think about a hiring team, for example, you being different as people or as judges when it comes to how harsh and lenient you are, and the fact that a 5 for someone will be, a clear yes, that is, 5-point scale, a clear yes for someone will be someone else's semi-yes. So we're different in how harsh we are. So that is one source of noise here. And the second one, that is the stable pattern noise. And stable pattern noise, that is the judge by case kind of interaction. So there's always an interaction between the case and the judge. And that will create noise. So it might be these kind of associations we can't name. It might be that someone just triggered a thought in you, or whatever, it can be an association. And this will happen, and your associations within you will interact. And it will be hard for us to know, okay, where will you land? And also between you and the other people in the hiring team, you will differ in the associations that you make. So for example, if we apply this to a specific example, one interview in an interview panel or a panel interview will think that quiet candidates are just, a little bit thoughtful. They are thinking a lot before they answer. while another might think that they are being disengaged and interpret it as that. So that would create noise, that you're different that way, that you make different associations. And this creates noise. And then the last source of noise, that is occasion noise. That's a very, very random source of noise. So that is things like the weather, your mood, that you woke up grumpy or happy, that it's sunny today or it's cloudy. All of that will affect you. And we are not always aware of that in the beginning of the day, we make different kind of judgment on the same data as we would on the end of the day. And that's pretty interesting. I want to break in a little bit here. I've spoken a little bit now. Do you recognize these 3 sources of noise? Have you noticed that?
Absolutely. Yeah? I just don't think I really had the words for it or like the concept in mind, but I have definitely seen it. And I think it's a little bit scary, like, to the candidate's point, and to have a fair and consistent recruitment process, like that is everyone's goal, right? But occasion noise as an example, like at one employer, we had like long interview days where we had several candidates interviewing in parallel, like, from morning to evening, more or less. And like the presence, the mood, the energy from the interviewers, it dropped throughout the day. And so did the scores also, actually. Right. So I think that is an aspect we definitely need to keep in mind to give the candidates as fair treatment as possible.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, and I think you're onto something, that sometimes we know things intuitively. We recognize this. I think we recognize all of these 3 sources of noise, right? But we don't always have the terms and the language to speak about it. And that is equally as important, that we all know how to kind of formulate ourselves around these issues, especially when speaking to people outside of hiring in the organization. I think that's very, very important.
Absolutely, because it's not only TA interviewing, right? It's often hiring managers and interview panels, and to be that expert in the room who can educate them is crucial.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, great. So if we go back to this then and talk about this, I mean, this is not about just disagreeing. I want to make that very, very clear before we continue this topic, because just disagreeing is not a problem. It might be that you're seeing different things, right? You have different perspectives on the same matter. But sometimes, and often, what I see from working with clients too, is that we kind of move on too fast. We are not stopping and thinking, why are we disagreeing here? Because oftentimes when we disagree, we take for granted that we were seeing different things, but in reality, we were actually looking for different things. We didn't have the system in place to kind of review and really have a think around, okay, but are we making it clear what we're looking for here? Are we making sure that these kind of sources of noise, such as people have different internal skills or the case by judge interaction, are affecting us? And that is what I want to give a framework for here today, based on general research around decision hygiene. So disagreement in itself is not the issue. It's the reason for that disagreement that I want to focus on here, and that should be the reason shouldn't be noise, basically. So why is it then that I'm speaking about noise, and why is it then that bias is usually the star of the show, right? We speak a lot about bias, and why is that then? Because we could take for granted that bias is the bigger issue because we speak about that often within hiring. But the reason for that, I think, especially within hiring, is somewhat the force of habit. We don't have the habit within hiring to do what Kahneman calls a noise audit. So just as I mentioned before, we kind of move on. When we see disagreement, we discuss it a bit, but we're not looking deeply enough, I think, usually, into the issue around, okay, is it noise that are affecting us? And you can't really reduce what you can't see, right? And I have full understanding, speaking about, the reality out there, that we are busy. But I'm hoping that the strategies we're going to talk about today will help everyone to have a think around their own ways of working and take one step, towards noise auditing their own organization. What Kahneman does is that he has this practice where he does noise audits for other companies. So he actually does this with teams and checks in different organizations, how noisy are you being, it seems, in your organization and your team. And what he does then usually is that he sends the same cases to different judges within that organization, and then he lets them score independently based on their ways of working, whatever it can be. And then you see how these professionals spread out and reports that. And that kind of noise audit, that is pretty common within research. I worked a little bit within research too. And what is common practice there is to audit your process and look at your kind of tendency to vary on similar scales. So, for example, what we did where I worked before was that we looked at the same patient's case. So it was recorded in that case. And then all of the researchers sat down, rated independently, and then we look at the spread. How much are we spreading out on a scale that should be similar to all of us? If the spread was large, I mean, if it's small differences, maybe it's not a big issue. But if it's large, then we need to speak about that to make sure that we calibrate that. And for hiring, that will mean that you do the same kind of exercise. Maybe we can't record the candidate, but you could do a role play, for example. So for one of your most common roles, you could role play the interview. If you have a specific interview template, role play an interview and sit down and score. And then see how much you're spread out and discuss that in order to calibrate. So now we actually open up the floor for our first poll, because I want to know, have anyone done this kind of task, something similar? It can be different things, but looking at how much you're spreading out in your kind of scoring. Have you done this, Frida, if we go to you first while people score this?
My honest answer is no, I haven't done this. But I think there is a lot to learn here. Like, as you mentioned, like having a more like systematic, data-driven, methodical approach and actually going back and seeing, like, I think that is crucial. But I haven't really done it. Like, we have had at previous companies 2 interviewers. I think that is the closest. Maybe 1 lead and 1 shadow. And then seeing like how those scores were different. And they often were. Like they often score differently. And then, of course, I as a TA facilitated that discussion, but kind of taking it to the next step, going back to the rubric or the system and the process to like learn from it and close the feedback loop in that sense. That hasn't been as common. So kind of missing the next step to actually learn from it and act on it.
And go deeper, right? Like, yeah. Very good. Okay, I'm going to look a bit at the score here, and it seems to be, majority seems to be on no, but there's surprisingly a lot of yes too, which I'm very, very happy about, because from my experience, this is very uncommon. So I'm very happy to see this, that you have actually done this, because I understand that in this world where things are moving fast, right? And usually you need to hire someone basically yesterday, we get it in. I can understand that this is not on top of your mind, but it is very, very important. So I'm happy to see those yeses. And if we move on, I want to speak about the fact that Kahneman, as I mentioned, he does this for companies. And I want to give a concrete example here. He and his team went out to this very, very big insurance company. And he did this noise audit exercise. He sent the same case to different underwriters and had them kind of assess them independently and quote them independently. And then he measured the spread. And the executives at this insurance company, they said, well, we think might spread out a bit, but not too much. We have clear guidelines, etc. And then they guessed. So they guessed that it would be 10%. So my next poll, actually I have a poll already for you guys, is what do you think was the actual spread that Kahneman and his team saw once the underwriters admitted their kind of judgment? What do you think? If you would guess, you have the alternatives here. We're going to wait a little bit here. And take your time, even though it's quiet, to vote a little bit and have a think. Yeah? Seems to be the middle alternative a little bit. Yeah, the second and the third alternative here. A little bit of a spread. So it seems to differ a little bit. And I can reveal the answer just a bit. Yeah, let's reveal the answer then. And when Kahneman actually looked at the numbers, he saw that it wasn't 10% as they had guessed. It was actually 55%. So that's a lot, right? So when one underwriter quoted 9.5K, the other one, a colleague, assessing the same case, right, with the same guidelines, would quote 16.7. That's pretty crazy that's the amount of spread they saw, especially since the executives thought it would only be 10% right. So they were pretty confident, I would say. And I think that's the case in many fields. We think that we are aligned when in reality we aren't. Like, we are spread out more than we think. And that's actually something that Kahneman mentioned a lot in the book I just mentioned, for example, that wherever there's human judgment, there will be more random variation than we would ever think. It's always there, and it's always more than we think. So insurance is just one example. This is evident wherever there's human judgment, which is basically everywhere, right? So why is that then? Well, there's different reasons for it. And something that you speak a lot about is the persistence of an illusion based on 4 different reasons. And one of them is that we have a shared language, but it can be pretty decorative. So the language is decorative more than have a full meaning. So we think we're meaning the same thing. We might be saying, for example, in hiring, we might be saying that we're looking for collaboration, but we're filling in the gaps ourselves. So we haven't defined collaboration enough, for example. So we have a shared language on the surface, but it's not deep enough and more decorative. The second reason for this kind of persistence of the illusion around us being aligned and why noise stays hidden is that we take for granted that if we have a competent and experienced team, it will make everything, consistent, and we can trust everyone's judgment. But in reality, research shows that can actually amplify people's quirks. So it can actually make things worse in some cases. So it's not something to take for granted that the more senior person will be a better judge, per se. Can be, but not always. And then the human thing that we don't like disagreement, usually. We differ a bit, of course, between humans, but most people don't like disagreements and conflicts. So we avoid that. So whenever there's a disagreement, we kind of avoid it a little bit, while that is actually a very important indication, especially if there's a big disagreement. You should think about why is that and go deep into that, basically. And then, lastly, the quiet failures. We do postmortems for big mistakes, but I think we should do them even more than we are today in many fields, including hiring. The last kind of reason for why bias is more, popular to speak about, I think, and why noise is not as popular and stays a bit hidden in many fields is that brains always prefer parts. We like that as human beings, and our brains like that. It's easy to grasp. So we kind of turn the parts a lot, especially, if you look on hiring, for example, we have a tendency to focus a lot on the different steps in the process and make sure that our different methods are valid. And that's super important, of course. It's critical that we have valid methods. But that's not enough, actually. We need to look broader than that. Because if we just turn these parts, that's kind of a stage-level solution to a system-level problem. Because it's the system around these methods that will also make a huge impact on your tendency to predict performance, basically find the right person for the job. So then the question comes, I've been speaking now a lot. And the question comes then, what can we do about this? Well, one of them is to start thinking about hiring in a more systematic way, have a systematic approach to hiring. Stop, focusing only on, the parts and start focusing on the system around these parts and how do we kind of tie them all together and make sure that there's as little noise as possible creeping in. And this is also in line with the latest meta study around methods predicting job performance that was done by Paul Sackett. He's very clear about the fact that in order to predict job performance, aka finding the right person for the job, you need to combine different methods. And to do that well, you need a system around that. So you need to have a really good system around your methods. And that's something we at Alva, of course, focus a lot on building. Since this is the latest research, that's what we want to build at Alva and kind of optimize our system for. And the 5 places to look for in a system is basically these 5. So having guidelines in place, making sure you really define what does good look like. For this role, for example, what does good look like? What kind of criteria do we need to have? I'm going to go deeper into all of these soon. And then the second one is structuring up your decisions. So making sure you have these kind of broken down attributes based on what you defined as successful or what good looks like. So you need to structure up your decision and break it down. The third strategy, that is to make sure you have the shared scale. And we've been speaking about this already, and I think that's something that is common to speak about within hiring. But I'm going to go deeper into this and talk about the fact that we're not calibrating enough. We're not doing the exercise that I mentioned before enough. Even though more than I thought here that are listening here today are doing it, I think we can do it even more to make sure we're calibrated. Because just having the scale is usually not enough. We need to calibrate continuously. Sequencing information, that can be a hot potato within hiring. We're going to speak about that. How much should you sequence information, aka kind of separate each step from each other, make sure one step or one assessment don't contaminate our way to assess the next thing or attribute. And the last thing is, of course, how do we combine? How do we aggregate everyone's assessments or judgments? And how do we do that well? So those are the 5 places to look at. And I'm going to start with guidelines, and I'm going to give you a chance to reflect after we've spoken about each strategy. You're going to get a chance to reflect around your own organization, and we're going to hear Frida's thoughts around these, so we get that kind of practical view on these too. So I want to remind everyone about the fact that what I'm speaking about right now, that's, the ideal goal. But then we have a practical reality out there that we need to be mindful of course. And I want to have that honest discussion. If you have any thoughts around any of these strategies and how to implement them in practice, please share in the chat too. We want that kind of interaction here today. So if we start and talk about guidelines, that's all about defining what good looks like. That's the first step. So these strategies build on each other's back, basically. So we start with guidelines. That's defining what does good look like, right? So this should be written down and signed off before even sourcing starts. And one thing I think, if we go deeper into this, because I think many consider that, well, we have criteria in place. But what you need to also keep in mind, I think, that many kind of forget, is the weights. If we don't explicitly say that this is more important than that, the must-have, nice-to-have, but also actually how much should each kind of criteria weigh into the decision here, people will fill in those blanks themselves. So we need to kind of define that too, the weights. So the best case scenario is that we have weighted role-specific criteria that we are aligned on before even sourcing start. And if we move on to the poll, you have these kind of the scale here, and I try to make it as clear as possible. So it goes from being absent. We don't have any written criteria, and each manager, recruiter, or hiring team member would kind of carry the role in their head and have their own view on that. That's A, the alternative A. And this scale goes then to E, which is the best case scenario. And that is that the guidelines are really embedded into your organization. And think broadly now across roles, across markets, across managers, are we kind of sticking to these guidelines? So every role launches with weighted role-specific criteria that we have signed off before even sourcing start. That's kind of the gold star. And while we get some ratings in here where everyone are today, I would like to ask your thoughts here, Frida, from your experience. What are your thoughts around guidelines? What becomes easy or hard, etc.?
Yeah, and I would assume this one to be a little bit higher in the scores compared to what's coming next.
Let's see.
Yeah, let's see. But the guidelines and kind of like defining what you're looking for and build a very thorough job description. I think that is best practice within TA. But with that said, like the weighting part, I think that's an important aspect that often get missed out on. And I love with Alva's hiring system that you are able to kind of know, okay, where do I measure what, like in which interview and what is most important? Because yeah, at the end of the day, like that makes it a lot more data-driven for the candidate. But again, I think in practice, like when maybe you hire for roles over and over again, and then it's very tempting to just like copy paste like the previous job criteria and job description. And I think that is a common mistake today when things are moving so fast and roles are changing very rapidly compared to before, that you need to like constantly oversee your criteria and your definition of what good look like. But also, as you mentioned before, like hiring is very rushed often, and with like attrition and backfills, then it's very common that you don't invest enough time here really, that you needed someone yesterday, as you said, and it becomes like a little bit too rushed. So that is another risk that I see.
Yeah, I can imagine that. And also that is what I hear from speaking to customers, that often it is kind of, you have to make quick calls and start sourcing and start finding candidates.
But that kind of hour maybe to spend on aligning this, I think you will save for sure, or I know you will save later on in the process.
That's the thing, right? Yeah. And it seemed like many people voted in the middle, around the middle. And that is also in line with my experience from working with clients, that that was why I mentioned the weighting aspect. I think many have, criteria in place maybe. But first of all, I think we could take another step usually when it comes to defining those more clearly, making sure that the hiring manager or recruiter doesn't fill in the gaps themselves, that we make it very, very clear. So that is that, and also the weights, as you mentioned, Frida. That is something that I notice a lot. That can be hard to do manually, right? And that's something that ideally a system supports. And as you mentioned, that's something we do a lot in our system. And then we're moving on to another strategy, very common within research around decision hygiene. And I don't know if I mentioned that, but decision hygiene is basically what do you need to make sure that you have good hygiene around the decisions you make, so you don't contaminate your decisions with, for example, irrelevant data. So another strategy to increase your decision hygiene, aka limit noise in your system, is structuring. And that has to do with breaking the decision down, right? So while guidelines is about defining what good looks like, structuring is about breaking that down. So if you have a criteria, for example, you need to be good at collaboration. Well, what is that? Break that down. How do we know and make a decision around, is this person likely to be good at collaborating? What can tell us that this person is likely to be good at that? So that's something to think about, because what has been shown by, for example, Kahneman and other researchers is that so-called super kind of forecasters or judges, they break the decision down a lot. So if it's a complicated decision, you need to break it down. It needs to be separately scored attributes. So there should be separate, distinct attributes that you assess one at a time. And then your final kind of decision, and in hiring, that means hire/no hire decision, should be built from those scored attributes and the weights that you have defined in the earlier steps. So that's very, very important too. So now I want to ask our audience, where are you here today? We have a scale here that goes from this holistic ways of working. And that's pretty common, to be honest, that assessors have this kind of hire, no hire, holistic view, that they make a holistic judgment. So would I hire or not hire this candidate? The problem with that is, of course, that it's pretty hard to audit or calibrate. And also it's easy to, after you made a decision, point to reasons to why you made that decision. But that can be kind of after the fact, if you understand what I mean. So that's number A here. And number E, or letter B, so alternative E, is about being mechanical. And that's the gold star version. So that means that you have these separately scored attributes that are combined mechanically. That's the best way to go about it if we look at research around decision, to have a mechanical way of working. So that would mean in hiring that everyone scores their attributes. So they score these attributes separately, and then that's combined mechanically. And the decision from an assessor or recruiter, manager, will be built from that, basically. So that would be the best case scenario according to research. What do you think about this, Frida, when we send out now the poll? What do you think? What are your reactions?
I think this is a big challenge, to be honest, at least in my experience. And I think it's common that it's overlaps, like that you assess the same thing over and over again in different methods, but also that it could be gaps, that you're kind of missing out to assess one part of your criteria. So I wouldn't expect too high scores here. Let's see, it's quite spread so far.
Right.
Interesting.
Yeah, I love that.
Yeah.
It's a little bit spread. Yeah.
And then we have like the whole system aspect again. I think that data and information and feedback, it's often very scattered, right, across different tools and systems. And that could also be challenging, like to kind of, in a scalable way, to handle that as a TA partner.
I can imagine, yeah. And that's also what I hear when I speak to clients. That is a real challenge. And I mean, again, it's about taking then that step towards this gold star version, if I'm going to call it that, the ideal version, because I totally understand that there's a reality out there. And my thinking is that we need to know what best is according to research, but then we need to do whatever we can within the situation we are in and in the reality we live in, of course. So very, very interesting to see that it was a bit more spread out maybe than we thought. And I think we should speak more to each other. That's something that I mentioned in today's. We had an ERL version. You might know that, those of you who signed up. So we had an ERL version this morning. And what I want to underline, that I also underlined there, is that we should speak more to each other about these struggles and be honest with them, because that's the only way we can learn from each other. Just seeing this, that we're spread out. Then someone has struggled with the same thing that you might have been struggling with, and you can learn a lot. So I just want to underline that, how important it is that we speak about this. Very good. Okay, so the third strategy I want to speak about here today is having a shared scale. And I think this one, we take for granted that we know what we are talking about here, right? It's something that we could talk about a lot within hiring. But I think that sometimes we miss the point that, I mean, it's good that we have a scale, but first of all, I think that the scoring anchors, so the anchors, that is the definition of each point in the scale. So what does a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 mean? What I've seen, at least, and Frida, you will build on this soon and say what you think, but what I've seen is that we can be a little bit more specific when writing these definitions. They shouldn't be like super long, of course, because then they are not manageable. And we need to be mindful of the fact that many people who recruit maybe just do it once. It can be a hiring manager who does it, here and there. And then we can't have super long definitions, but they should be clear enough. And they should be on a behavioral level, right? So we should have representatives' behaviors for each point in the scale. And then also, I think the calibration part is something that we should do more within hiring. So the thing that I just mentioned before, the kind of exercise of doing a role play or looking at the same work sample example and then rate it together. So it can be a previous work sample you have gotten in, and you want to see how aligned would we be if we rated the same one, and then see how much you spread out. Because that's the only way to ensure that you are more calibrated, that you audit it that way. So when it comes to this, I'm curious to see where we are today. So we have the alternatives here. So it goes from A, and that is narrative only. So basically no rating scale. So it's going to be narrative summaries. And that's reality for some companies. That's what we have in place, that people write summaries of what they thought. And then E, that is that you have this kind of regular calibration going on. You have the clear scale, you have these kind of scoring anchors, and then you also calibrate consistently across both teams and roles. So this means that you will be able to catch any drift, and that you are a bit scattered, and correct for that. So that's the E version of this. So now we're going to send out the poll, and I'm curious to hear your thoughts first, Frida, from your experience.
Yeah, this is an interesting one for sure. And I think that it's easy to just be happy with that you have a scale in itself, like 1 to 5. That is, of course, moving the needle in the right direction. But I believe you need to invest quite a lot of time to have a shared language around what do we actually mean with a 1, with a 3, with a 5, just as you mentioned before. I have actually ongoing discussions with one of my customers at the moment about this, and how to really align and calibrate, because in their experience and also from my career, I think it's very easy that you either think that like a 5 is a very detailed and a nuanced example, a lot in depth. But some maybe, think only about, the scale that the candidate have worked on, or the global impact they have had, or the complexity of their examples. Some kind of rate that very highly, versus others think a lot about, the kind of fail fast and the learning aspect, that you have kind of, that awareness of your potential mistakes, and you have learned from that, and that should be scored very, very highly. And other maybe think about, the collaboration aspect, that you have, you're generous with your knowledge, that you're sharing with others, etc. And you have that kind of impact. So a 5 can mean so much. So, narrowing that down for this specific role, for this specific trait, etc., what does good look like? Because it can be, it's not enough just to say that you have 1 to 5. I think you need to very, very thoroughly define it for that specific role.
Yeah. And I mean, a first step might be that you do that for your most common roles, right? If you think about the first small step. Yeah, let's look at the results then. See here. So, yeah, it seems like this is, we have most answers in the middle somewhere. So, a little bit like you spoke about. But the calibration part, I mean, I really believe that's something we should do more often. Something that we do a lot, as I said, in research. And I think you can't do it exactly like there. It's always going to be a special world. But I think we can be inspired and do this kind of exercise the way that is applicable and possible in our field. Because this will help you to be sure that you have this kind of real shared language. That it's not only decorative, that we also know that we're meaning the same thing. And that not this level noise, this source of noise that I mentioned, where people have different kind of internal scales, influence your decisions too much. Very good. We're going to move on to the 4th strategy. And I mentioned before that this might be a little bit of a discussion point. There's different views on this. Of course, we need to build our view and build on the information we have gathered so far. So this is not about zero information transfer. It's about what information are we transferring and how. How do we make sure that we're not saying things that are very human and very common, like, oh, you're gonna love this person. So, for example, you tell the hiring manager that before they go into an interview, you're gonna love her. That kind of makes it more likely that this hiring manager will look for evidence when it comes to that. And it creates noise in the system. So the question is, what are we saying and how are we saying it? And I think like one concrete example that is very common is that when we go into an interview, we want to dig deeper into aspects that we saw in the beginning of the process that might stand out in a certain kind of way. So let's say that someone has made a personality or completed a personality test. The candidate has completed the personality test. It's kind of stood out a little bit towards the stress-sensitive side. And we know that this role will entail a lot of high tempo and a lot of things to do. So we want the hiring manager to kind of look into that a bit. I think the difference here is that, okay, so if we're sequencing the information, we make sure that we maybe add a question about stress tolerance. So we add a question that looks into, okay, can you explain to me a certain situation where you were stressed? How did you handle that? And what was the result? You know, this kind of interview question, focusing on past experience, because that is what you should focus on in an interview, instead of saying, well, you should really look into stress tolerance because in the test, the result was this and this. I think that's the difference, and make sure that we're not oversharing, because if we're oversharing, we will kind of make it more likely that both we trigger bias, so confirmation bias, that the person will look for indications that are in line with the view that we already have, but also we're creating noise. So we're adding information and we're adding this kind of randomness to the decision. So the good look like here, so the gold star version here looks like, okay, we are not sharing specific scores or assessments. We're just thinking about what should we look at next based on this and focusing on that. So if we look at the scale here, I'm going to soon send out a poll. The A version here is that everyone reads everything before. So that might be that everyone can access all of the results and also have the habit. Because, I mean, sometimes you have systems, like Alva's system is pretty good that way, that you can limit with the access levels what you see pretty well. So that, for example, hiring managers do not see the personality test results. They just see their interview template. But either way, you can do this manual too. So have strict rules around this, that you do not look at the results before. And you focus on what you are assessing, basically, in that specific stage. So A here was that everyone reads everything. And then they jump in to assess whatever they're going to assess in that stage. While E is that you actually have a system in place and a way of working in place that makes sure that this is enforced, that you are sequencing information so that everyone can focus on what they're actually supposed to focus on. So notes will stay private until you have that kind of debrief where you're supposed to look at all of the results and make a final decision. Okay, so we're going to send out the poll, and I wonder, what do you think about this, Frida?
This is a juicy one.
Yeah,
a hot potato, as you said. Because I think that best practice within TA has often been that you want to, package and summarize information from like each step of the process to the next one. And I think it's a lot about that you want to, be prepared and inform the next person to be able to dive deeper into certain areas, etc. But you might not think enough about which negative consequences does that actually give, with the bias and the noise. So that blank piece of paper approach, that everyone is completely blank and unbiased when they enter the room. I haven't seen that as much as, the more informative way.
Yeah, I also think that's more common, right? Yeah.
But what you said, the finding that sweet spot in between, not sharing anything versus sharing, your whole judgment. There should be something in between, right? That you're packaging a little bit of probes, but you're not putting any judgmental aspects to it.
And not that's exactly it. Thinking about what does this person need to know and keeping the rest kind of separate.
Yeah. And here I think like we in TA also need to watch out a little bit, because we're often on the candidate's side, let's put it that way, and we really believe in them. We want, to make them successful so that we are not contributing like even more with that noise in the process.
Very, very good point. Yeah. Let's see what the polls says here. Yeah, we have actually, so it's pretty spread out. We do not have anyone who have voted for A, but then we have a little bit of a spread. And it seems like we could do a little bit more work when it comes to the enforced part, I guess, pushing towards that. But again, I think this is quite well. I mean, good work, because
Absolutely.
I think this is pretty hard. And as you say, there is this kind of view that more information is better. That more information will help us decide. But actually, in reality, it depends on what information it is, right?
It's a classic, just throwing in another interview just to be 100% sure.
Exactly. Very, very interesting. Okay, so the last strategy I want to talk to you about today is aggregating, and that is combining independent reads. So this has to do with the last decision, right? So how do we combine everyone's reads to make sure that not the highest voice or the most senior voice gets too much of a weighting here in the final decision? So the best version of this, if we move on to actually poll alternatives, is that, okay, A, that's actually that one person calls it in the end. That weighs a lot, and that maybe that's the hiring manager, that kind of rules it all. And then E, that is when everyone scores separately, and everything is, as we talked about, sequenced. So we see everyone's assessment and final kind of call in the end, in the debrief, and then we discuss the spread there and make our final decision. So let's send out the poll. What do you think about this, Frida? Just shortly.
I think there's also like two different sides here. Like either you do this full evaluation meeting that you bring in like everyone to have a saying and a discussion in the same room, or this is the responsibility of the TA and the hiring managers like together to do this. And I think the more you have been successful with the other steps, I think you can rely on the documentation and the feedback much more, and the scoring. So then it could be enough with just like the TA and the hiring manager sitting down together to kind of avoid these bias and noise parties that it often can be with a full room of judges.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Let's look at the results here. Yeah. So here we have a little bit. It's leaning towards the beginning of the scale. So I think thinking about what kind of step can we make to make sure that everyone shares their view first, and then we kind of make our final decision. And I see that the clock is ticking. So I'm going to talk about what the next steps here are, because of course we at Alva want to help you with all of this. And we have a system that helps with all of these steps. And what we also want to do as a next step is, of course, to help you either way, even if you're not a customer. I'm very passionate about this topic and want to do my best to ensure that hiring becomes better when it comes to reducing noise. So hiring team focus on that more, because as I mentioned, it's both about bias and noise. They're equally important. So I'm going to send a practical guide that you can use, first of all, to score your own organization, a little bit like we did now, but maybe more, thorough. And then also you got a practical guide around what can you do next, some tips and tricks and next steps for the fall, and what kind of pitfalls you should, and common, traps to avoid when implementing these next steps. And I hope that will be some kind of inspiration for the fall. And a simple test for any kind of investment you make going forward is to ask yourself, does this investment help us with any of these decision hygiene strategies that I just spoke about? If it does, you're taking the right step towards reducing noise within your hiring. And then we also, this fall, we're going to launch a Masterclass cohort that I highly recommend you to sign up for. It's going to be a small curated group of people, and we're going to have experts who talk about their topics specifically. You're going to learn a lot. And this is going to help you with everything from evidence-based hiring, how to kind of business framing, AI, which is a hot topic, of course, right now. So we're going to send more information about that, and you're going to be able to sign up to that. So keep an eye out for that, and reach out to us if you want to discuss noise and how to limit it in your hiring. Thank you, everyone, for today. Have a nice weekend.
Thank you, Anna.
Thank you, Frida.